Chapter 5, Section 4, Alexander's Empire. So a big question to ask ourselves before we look at this section is, was Alexander the Great great? And it connects to another big question where, what does it mean to be a good leader, right? For example, this is just a random ranking from Ranker. These are all considered more or less great leaders. Thomas Jefferson, MLK Jr., Alexander the Great has made that list too. And what makes these leaders great? And that's a concept I want you to have in the back of your head as we look at Alexander the Great and the Macedonians. So Alexander the Great, as you can see, conquered a vast amount of territory during his rule, and that's sort of the peak of his rule. You can see there he's got part of Egypt, he's got pretty much all of what was once Persia, he has what was once Greece as well, all of that under his territory. And there's another picture sort of portraying all the territory he had. Now, before we talk about Alexander, we have to look at his father, King Phillip II, a brilliant tactician, brilliant general, and he attacks the Greek city-states once the Athenians and Spartans stop fighting. So he realizes it's good timing, right? The Greek city-states are no longer unified, they're damaged from the war, and this proves to be very successful, and Philip II is able to increase the land that the Macedonians have by starting off with attacking northern Greece and then slowly taking over the rest. Now, a key battle during this time was the Battle of Chaeronea, and this battle was important for several reasons. So one, we see the son of Philip II prove himself as being a great general. So sometimes there's a problem when power is passed on from a father to son. This could be even in modern day, when companies are passed down from father to son, where sometimes the son isn't quite as good as the father, right? And he maybe shouldn't be getting power. But in Alexander's case, there was no nepotism. From the beginning, it seemed like he was the best man for the job. So in battles, he would prove his worth. He would be always in front fighting. He was a very successful general. And by the end of this battle, the Macedonians had completely taken over Greek territory. Philip II created the League of Corinth, and this is how he was able to organize the Greek city-states to be under Macedonian rule. However, he ended up dying when he was assassinated by a bodyguard at his daughter's wedding. Therefore, the very young Alexander at age 20 was taking over as leader of Macedon. So Alexander's early life was one of great hope. So he was tutored by the famous Aristotle. He became king at a young age, but as I mentioned earlier, he was already proving himself as a great general and a great leader. And at one point in history, he was a king and a pharaoh and a general. So he was truly a great leader in that sense. But he was also incredibly ruthless. So a good example is when he took over Persia. So the leader at the time of Persia, Darius III, tried to negotiate with Alexander the Great, but Alexander the Great took no offers. He did not take any negotiations, no compromises, and he said, I want to take all of Persia. And that's exactly what he does. Not just Persia, but Egypt as well. And he marches into Persia and he burns down their capital, Persepolis. And the burning down of Persepolis was also the sign of the end of this huge empire known as the Persian Empire. So what's interesting is different accounts of Alexander the Great show his greatness, but also some others show that he may have been kind of a madman, almost crazy. So some examples of that would be that he had won very little trust of those around him. So he believed in himself quite strongly, but seemed to not have much trust for those around him. He also would do really reckless things, like when in battle, he would choose to fight in the front part of his cavalry, which is very risky, right? Most leaders stay in the back because it's better that the leaders survive and give orders instead of fighting in the front lines. So it's interesting to think about when you look at historical leaders, contemporary leaders. A lot of them do have sort of that similar characteristic, though, where they're kind of half brilliant but also half madman. So some of the great accomplishments by Alexander include, first of all, finding over 20 plus cities called Alexandria, including the very famous Alexandria in Egypt, where the Royal Library of Alexandria exists. Now, his death also came at a very young age, and it still remains a mystery. Some of the theories include that he may have died from alcohol poisoning, he may have died from a fever, he may have been poisoned by others, and we still are not sure. And originally, the main theory was that he was poisoned, but part of this had to do with the psychology of justifying the death of great leaders. So what I mean by that is that people don't want to think that great leaders can just simply die from a fever, right? They think, oh, I must have been poisoned or assassinated. So that was part of the reason why, for a long time, a prevailing theory was that he was poisoned. But as mentioned earlier, it's a mystery. It could have been any one of these four, or something else even. So what is his legacy? Well, he was able to meld together these various cultures: Egypt, Macedonia, Persia, Greece, and he put all four of these together into one. And upon his death, they got split up again, but for that brief period, that part of the world was all united under one leader, which is pretty extraordinary. And another thing that makes him sort of very interesting is how long his legacy has lasted. So, hundreds of years later, Napoleon Bonaparte, very famous general, looked up towards Alexander the Great as a source of inspiration. And another reason why he kind of remains as sort of this legendary figure is he died at age 32. So if you consider all he completed, you saw with your own eyes how big that empire was at age 32. There's a lot of what ifs. If he was still alive at age 40, 50, would the empire of Macedon have conquered half the world? We'll never know. And it's an interesting parallel we can draw with various people from history with this what if question. So for example, people wonder, what would happen if Bruce Lee had lived till 50? James Dean, would he have been in 30, 40 movies? Would he have won many, many Oscars? And what would the world be like if MLK Jr. was still alive today? There's just a lot of what ifs, and I think that's part of also what Alexander the Great's legend is. So just a few more things about Alexander the Great. So one thing that made him incredibly interesting was he would fight from the front lines, which was incredibly inspirational for his troops, but at the same time very, very reckless. Very, very Alexander the Great-like. He was very courageous in war, but this also meant he had many injuries. He had something like 20, 30 serious injuries by the time he had died. He was quick in decision and action. His men were fiercely loyal to him because, as I mentioned earlier, he would fight in the front lines even though he had a leader position. He was ruthless and merciless, so that seems to be another pattern we see with a lot of leaders up to the 20th century. And he understood PR very well, which is why he wrote down a lot of his own history, and he made sure that people would have a very good image of him. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.